Hello everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today we're looking at the Recoil rework of patch 14 and how it's fixed more than just the recoil itself. There have been numerous long-standing issues with recoil that have plagued the community for years, and in one fell swoop, BSG have managed to get rid of 5 of the most egregious ones altogether, which is a pretty impressive feat. But to start with, let's take a peek at our first and most obvious fix, the initial shot recoil. Previously, pretty much every gun in Tarkov came with an exaggerated burst of recoil at the beginning of its spray pattern, reaching the apex of the weapon's recoil at around bullet 5 or 6 before drifting back down to some middle ground for the rest of a full auto spray. This meant that you were just better off using full auto for the stabilization effect at the end most of the time. Semi-auto was used sometimes, but burst felt truly awful to shoot. Now, after patch 0.14, the recoil pattern moves upwards almost purely vertically for the first 5 shots before settling into a full auto spray with a wider horizontal recoil. This means that, for the first time, full auto is truly a trade-off between accuracy and rate of fire, and semi-auto or controlled bursts are finally superior in long-range situations rather than just holding down mouse 1. Obviously, different guns handle differently depending on their recoil stats and fire rates, as well as I'm sure some other factors that we'll come to understand over the coming weeks and months. But for now, SMGs are by far the most controllable with low levels of recoil, but typically with not as good bullets, with assault rifles in the middle and full-powered DMR type weapons a little unruly on full auto but totally controllable on semi. Here I have an MP9N, an AK-12 and a ScavTalk, which demonstrates the point very well. The MP9N fires extremely quickly at 1100 RPM, but with only 44 recoil, it's fairly easy to get the rounds on target at short to close medium distances. The first 6 bullets go up in a line, and after that the spray widens out a little. The AK-12 with 66 recoil is not quite as easy to control on the full auto spray as the MP9N, but very fast semi-auto dramatically reduces the lateral recoil of the weapon, which is very powerful when used at medium and longer ranges. The initial burst is around 7 shots of near vertical climb before settling into a wider full auto pattern just like the MP9 but with a slightly more violent shake. With the ScavTalk, this takes about 6 shots to get to the top of the vertical climb, and as we said, it is a little wild, but using semi-auto instead you can get much better shot placement. Clearly this is at the expense of fire rate, but the idea is that you'll connect with a much greater proportion of bullets fired. With the high initial recoil gone, short bursts and semi-auto feel great and clean, with full auto still valuable for closer range fights. So onto issue 2, the weapon pivot point, the flip, or whatever you want to call it. This has been resolved. The problem was basically that most weapons were recoiling around the pistol grip as a pivot point, which is fine for pistols, but for everything else it didn't feel like there was any point of contact between the stock and our PMC's shoulder. One of the most obvious examples of this was using the M4 with iron sights, as once you took a shot the sights misaligned because of the pistol grip pivot and it was a total nightmare to use. Now this is so much better, irons are usable and it feels like our weapon is actually being held by our PMC rather than the muzzle shooting upwards for no reason when the weapon was fired. The most interesting part of all of this though is that changing the pivot point seems to have fixed a bunch of other problems as well, including issue number 3, which is powered optics losing sight picture. Prior to this patch, there were lots of scopes that were avoided by the player base, for example the ACOG, which did get better in the Recoil rework but still had serious problems on full auto. Another classic for this was the TAC-30, amazing on semi-auto, but you stick this on an M4 with 800 RPM fire rate and unless it is completely modded out, you actually just can't see your target after the first 3 shots. But now if we take a look at firing these weapons, even with practically unmodded guns, you can full auto out of them no problem. Yes, the recoil pattern is a little bit sprayy and it might be quite hard to control, but you can at least see through the optic to see what's going on. For many of these old scopes that just really weren't used before, especially in the late game because of how terrible they looked on full auto, loads of them now look like the Voodoo, the Razor and the Schmidt 128, which is why those ones were chosen so much more previously, and this seriously opens out our choice of scope in this new patch. The next up, problem number 4, which was actually another issue tied to the pivot point and the misalignment of the weapon during the old Recoil, which was with Reflex Sights. There's a reason that players typically in the past had used the EOTech hollows mounted to the actual weapon on the regular Picatinny rail, and that was because canted and handguard mounted sights really weren't very good with the old Recoil system. When firing with these sights really far away from the PMC, you could often find that the reticle itself actually used to just jump out of the frame completely and you couldn't see what you were firing at anymore, making them borderline useless. But now, even with tiny dots like the PK06 and a heavy recoil weapon like the ScavTalk, we can see pretty clearly through it even when firing, which seems like a miracle. I used to dislike canted sights for this very reason, but have been using one on a ScavTalk in some of my recent streams, and it is now perfectly doable to fire through it, which is a massive win. Issue number 5 that is now resolved is pistols shooting low. The way the recoil was designed before meant that pistols had a very high recoil number but a fast return to center time to simulate the barrel popping up and down as you fire. However, the recoil was probably too high before and you'd lose sight picture on each shot, leading to players to spam the trigger, but this introduced a strange problem where the pistol would often shoot even lower than where you were aiming. This was due to the overly aggressive return to center movement that would overshoot slightly, and firing at the fastest possible speed got into a pattern of firing each shot under where you think it would go. Again, with the new recoil in patch 14, this is also gone. Not only are pistols hugely more controllable, no matter how fast you fire them, you don't end up hitting below your target, which is excellent. I'm not a big pistol user, but between this and the armor hitbox changes, pistol runners should have a much better time this patch than ever before. So with a new recoil system is going to come with a bunch of other quirks, and one that I've noticed particularly strongly is the changes to point fire. This certainly feels different to me, but obviously I can't go and test how it was before now. But point fire seems to be quite a lot less accurate than it used to be, and actually gives you more recoil than you would expect, especially if you're not using a laser on the full auto mode. With a laser it is slightly better, but aim down sight's recoil is significantly improved versus point fire, even in terms of how high the recoil pattern goes. Another interesting quirk is optics and left shoulder shooting. Because the stance change affects how close a scope is to your player's eye, this has an effect on the apparent magnification of the zoom. Typically, left side shooting brings the scope slightly closer to your PMC, leading to a larger reticle on screen and a higher perceived magnification. All that is happening here is that the sight picture fills the screen more, but it's quite cool actually, because with something like the LCAN, we effectively have two slightly different zoom modes to choose from in both 1x and 4x. I don't think this needs changing because it gives options to the player. The last thing I want to show you is the theoretical difference between a meta weapon and a stock weapon. The gap between these has been made much smaller, and this is primarily down to recoil reducing attachments and their values. Obviously I can't buy a meta M4 yet, but building one with the lowest recoil possible in the workbench only comes to 45 recoil now rather than the old 23. While the feel of the new recoil system is very different, so the numbers aren't really comparable, almost every muzzle and suppressor, at least in 5.5.6, has changed in stats. I'll pop up a table here that I've compiled for this wipe, and you can see there are now 4 suppressors that all have the same total recoil reduction with varying ergonomic impacts. One other cool thing to point out is that the unsuppressed jailbreak plus bulletech combo is now the same recoil as the best suppressor combo, finally beginning to address the consistent underpowering of loud builds in Tarkov. Something similar has happened in 7.6.2 as well. As you can see, the Knight's Armament PRS QDC break combo is now minus 17 recoil, which is the best that you can get, although this has decent ergonomics, so it probably will continue to be fairly good. But some of the others are quite close to those values as well, and who knows, with this new meta we might end up seeing people push much more towards ergonomic centric builds instead, so something like the Daniel's Defense Wave might actually get used a lot more. Something similar has happened to the loud builds as well, and for the first time in a very long time we have a loud build that actually beats out the best suppressor combo. So the BMD is now at minus 18 total recoil versus the minus 17 from the Knight's Armament. Obviously the downsides of running loud is that people can hear where you're shooting from, but with, again, they push into more ergonomic centric builds, you may find more people running this kind of BMD combo on something like an AKM or on a Mutant or an RD. So next up, go and check out my first investigation into the new armor mechanics in this video here. Otherwise, as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.